our aim with Lightning Pay is to connect New Zealand to the Lightning Network. And it started with the opportunity to, we can create a modern contactless payments solution that runs on Lightning, because Lightning's so fast, incredible, and settles instantly, that people could then use at first alongside, but then replacing those really expensive point of sale costs.
Hello, I am Cody Ellingham, and this is the Transformation of Value podcast. In this episode, I catch up with Dr. Simon Collins. We discuss some new research that Simon has contributed to in his new affiliation with the Digital Assets Research Institute, along with the Satoshi Action Fund, providing academic insight for measuring and understanding Bitcoin adoption. We talk about the next steps for Simon's Bitcoin mining company, Stacker, as they look to expand their operations in some exciting new directions internationally. And finally, we discuss Lightning Pay, which is creating an amazing merchant payment system and offers the fastest and most cost-effective exchange experience for buying Bitcoin in New Zealand. If you would like to support my work and growing this show, please consider tipping some Bitcoin to the show's wallet. Otherwise, pass this episode on to a friend who you think may enjoy it. If you have any questions or feedback, please reach out. My emails are always open, hello@thetransformationofvalue.com. Otherwise, on to the show.
I think we just start. Yeah, let's just start.
Just jump in.
Yeah. Here you go.
This is a cool studio.
Yeah, it's pretty handy, eh?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's great.
Yeah. These are kind of these sacred spaces for creative people. They're sort of very nice and awesome to be let in to these places to do stuff and record a podcast. And
and this is the Bitcoin community, isn't it? Like, I don't know if I've ever been told outright no by a Bitcoiner, and I ask for a lot of favors.
Yeah, no, it's a collaborative project in a sense, and I've found that. I mean, my travels through Europe over the last couple of weeks when I was there, people went out of their way to meet with me and to share what they're working on, and no matter what country I was in, there was sort of Bitcoiners that you could find.
I've been all around Southeast Asia in the last 12 months, and Taiwan, Korea, Australia, and I've tried to meet Bitcoiners in every one of those countries, and every single one, when you're visiting from another country, every group will offer to change the time or the date of a meetup, or meet you up for a coffee individually or in person, so that it's like a very welcoming kind of environment, isn't it? And I think it's the same when some international Bitcoiner comes here. Our local community steps up or steps in to the opportunity to kind of show them what Bitcoin's like in New Zealand, what good things to do are, what are good things to do while you're here. I think it's interesting because, of course, Bitcoin's getting bigger and bigger. There's more stuff being built on it. There are more people using it. There are more people saving in it. But it's still got the community feel driven by the recognition that we still have a long way to go, and that we only get there if we go together.
Yeah, I mean, it's a community project, and I mean, it's good for us today catching up, because just yesterday we had the BitKiwi meetup in Christchurch, which was, I thought it was a great success. I mean, how did you find that, Simon?
Oh, look, that's I've been to several BitKiwis now. I can't say that I've been to all of them, because there have been schedule conflicts and travel for some of them, but this is easily my fourth, even fifth. I think those guys have really hit their stride in terms of how they organise these events, but also I think Christchurch deserves a lot of recognition for having a very organised, close-knit, but also reasonably large kind of core group of Bitcoiners who come together, whether it's Andrew Wells and Matt Lamb and Woody and all of those guys who meet really regularly and are all in constant contact and are there to turn out for these kinds of events, not just in Christchurch, but also around the rest of the country. And so I think when I arrived at the BitKiwi halving party, there was maybe 5 or 6 people there. When I arrived early to yesterday's BitKiwi, it was already a full room.
Yeah.
And so I think that was the key metric. I mean, it was a good way to analyze the metric of success there was that it started with a full room and ended with a full room, 4 hours later. So it was great.
Yeah, no, I think Christchurch is certainly a lot of stuff happening. And I mean, I had been down here for a few days and I had met with some other Bitcoiners prior, and that sort of central city, which is sort of growing on me as a really cool place. There's sort of co-working spaces, innovation hubs, cafes, all of the stuff you need for a modern city, and sort of the connectivity of it was really awesome. And this kind of connects as well with not just the Bitcoin, the technology side and the monetary side, but looking at the infrastructure. And we talked to a lot of people yesterday around the role of energy, Bitcoin mining, these kinds of questions. And I mean, perhaps that's where we could start today with our conversation. Your work with Stacker and your company there.
We came together over Bitcoin several years ago, and it was actually during kind of COVID lockdowns. We were talking a lot on the phone every day about Bitcoin, about investment strategies, and it came up that mining is something that's not done in New Zealand, that it's got to be a really great way to make Bitcoin or to earn Bitcoin rather than buying it if you can get your average cost down, and that New Zealand, particularly at the time, didn't have any Bitcoin mining at scale, and we started to recognize that as a strategic risk to New Zealand, that if you aren't going to build the infrastructure layer of what is going to be the most important monetary asset in the world in short order or over time, then that's a risk for New Zealand, and nobody else was going to pick up the mantle at the time. So we decided we would business case what it looked like to get something, small scale, but that could scale together. And that's what we've been working on for the last few years. We started at very small scale, as you know, Cody, in a warehouse in central Christchurch. But what became very obvious was to be an on-grid miner in New Zealand is a really hard task, because you are competing for a scarce resource. Energy in New Zealand is not as abundant as it potentially could be. We have spent a long time under-investing in new capacity, and now that there's a desperate need for electrification, and as everybody's cars are moving onto the grid, and large facilities that may have been off-grid using coal or diesel in the past are now moving on-grid too, the demand for energy in New Zealand is increasing, and that is a very tight market for Bitcoin mining to operate in. Now, there are other places in the world where Bitcoin mining has found useful niches in otherwise constrained energy networks and energy systems. But in New Zealand, we don't, because again, we're very small, we don't have those niches at scale that again makes Bitcoin mining a proposition that you could invest in to get real scale, to give people jobs, to create self-sustaining, revenue for people or for revenue for the business, and to create a value proposition that goes above and beyond just buying Bitcoin with what you would spend on that operation. So we have spent the last kind of couple of years transitioning Stacker away from New Zealand, and that was a really difficult decision to make, but ultimately it was an imperative anyway. We weren't going to survive here because we weren't going to be able to operate at the scale, and we weren't going to be able to attract investment that would enable us to enter with scale and enter negotiations with generators who might want to sell energy at a price that Bitcoin mining can sustain. And in general, I'm just bagging on New Zealand. New Zealand's energy system. We had a very positive discussion about New Zealand's energy system yesterday. I'm gonna backstop it with some pure bitching, but generators in New Zealand are pretty inherently hostile to Bitcoin.
Oh, really?
Yeah, we have engaged where we can and where they have allowed us to in discussion about what Bitcoin mining can offer in terms of, ancillary services like demand response. And I know GridShare do have demand response Bitcoin mining operating in New Zealand, and that's awesome. But the really large generators, the ones that could potentially offer scale to Bitcoin miners, they're fundamentally hostile, because they don't have to. They just don't have to deal with something that might come with any sort of political downside, any sort of reputational risk.
So sort of conservative in nature, perhaps?
The best way I've had it described to me is that New Zealand generators are all in a race to be second.
Oh, really? Interesting.
Like, nobody wants to be the first. And let's not forget that Contact Energy had their fingers burnt pretty badly by an international Bitcoin miner who came in, required a resource consent. The terms of the resource consent required that Contact and Aurora Energy in Central Otago upgrade a local substation so that they could provide for not just for 10 megawatts of draw in Bitcoin mining, but also for the growth of the region, Clyde, Cromwell, the rest of the sort of settlements around Central Otago that access that node. And then that company fell over before they even turned on their machines, leaving Contact and Aurora with millions in outlay on unnecessary upgrades to local infrastructure.
I'm sure they're going to be valuable one day.
It'll be valuable one day, but the business case for doing that work was predicated on having somebody
to take the load,
paying $1,000 an hour for electricity that they were buying 24/7.
Yes.
From now until 2034. And so you can imagine that every other large generator in New Zealand looked at that and went, well, not for us, thank you.
Interesting. Well, that I mean, as you say, we've been talking with the GridShare guys about the way they've approached things, but it sounds like Stacker is looking overseas and, the opportunities over there. And, I mean, let's be real, New Zealand also has quite shallow capital markets locally, so you'd be looking at, I imagine, overseas investment for anything of scale for a large project.
That's right. That's a very eloquent nudge there, Cody. So we at Stacker we're on the precipice of a pretty epic deal. I can only allude to it at this time, but basically we've managed to string together the benefit of the US capital markets, some brand recognition, and the emerging Latin American market for very, very low cost and renewable energy. So there's I would hope that the next time we record a podcast, we can talk about all of the details.
I understand.
But at the moment, we have to be a little bit tight-lipped. But we have pivoted from bringing a strategic asset to New Zealand in terms of hash power to committing to bringing the wealth from a strategic asset back to New Zealand. So we're aiming for really significantly higher hash power than we could ever fund, finance, and operate in New Zealand, in Latin America, and we'll return the wealth that we make from that to New Zealand in Bitcoin terms.
That's really awesome, and there's something quite powerful about that, because you often hear of overseas investment in New Zealand and sort of things being sold off or the wealth kind of leaving, but much less often you hear the stories of the New Zealand successes that are actually bringing money in from overseas. And there are a few of these sort of sleeping unicorn sort of type businesses. I know Waikato Milking Systems is one that's often talked about, which is world-class dairy facilities which have been built all over the world based on New Zealand IP and infrastructure for how you do dairy and that sort of thing. But I also know within the kiwi fruit industry, sort of New Zealand Zespri's production methods, and it's got a IP being grown in other countries, and then that wealth kind of flows back. And maybe it sounds similar with what you're discussing. There's sort of the IP, and there's kind of weightless concepts of what are exported, and then the value comes back, but it's being built overseas and it's being operated overseas. So it's sort of, I guess, a flip side of the classic image of New Zealand being, brought up or sort of sold off in a sense, perhaps.
It's a very good point. I mean, we'll be exporting New Zealand expertise to South America to deliver on this, and the capability that we've built in New Zealand. It's
high value stuff, right? And I mean, as I said, with the Waikato Milking Systems, they don't sell the nuts and bolts and the metal and all of the stuff used and materials. It's the concepts and the IP and the consultancy, and that's the high value add export economy, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And so I mean, the reality is that there's a third country here that's going to get it's going to get seven figures of investment into its borders through this deal. It's a shame that's not New Zealand, but needs must. And, the other thing to keep in mind is that the promise of Bitcoin mining is that it can be done anywhere there's energy. It's not geographically bound in the same way that a copper miners or a bauxite miners or the smelter that smelts bauxite into aluminium, for example. Those things tend to be pretty specifically geographically bound in where they can be situated. And so limiting ourselves just to New Zealand or just to particular places because that's what we feel like we should be doing is kind of runs counter to a lot of the narrative around, what Bitcoin mining is, why it's good for grids, why it can be useful to foundering or stranded energy generation assets, all that kind of narrative, which is we've been built up and we've been documenting in case studies out of places like Texas and the rest of Latin America for a long time now. We're just gonna we're now living that in Stacker.
Yeah, that's really awesome to hear, and thank you for sharing that. I'm wondering, you've made this move to do this stuff overseas. There is still, it seems, a great deal of opportunity though in New Zealand, and maybe it's a different sector or different approach. But I guess, what are your thoughts, Simon, on how this conservatism of these New Zealand power generators, maybe a communication issue there, a bit of a brand image issue, perhaps. How do you see the communication or kind of the public relations of the value of Bitcoin mining for New Zealand? Is there a pathway for actually communicating what it could mean so that in the future maybe we could actually have more local operations?
Yeah, I think we're at a critical emergent time for those kinds of discussion. So over the past 12 months, I've worked a lot with Dennis Porter's Satoshi Action Fund in the United States. Dennis Porter, of course, and Satoshi Action have passed right to mine bills in different states in the US so that that particular industry can, have freedom to operate, freedom to invest in facility. So that the operators know that they're not going to get
or suddenly shut down, or
overnight tax of 30% on their electricity, or shut down wholesale for no reason other than you run afoul of the political winds of change at the time. So working with Dennis, I've worked with his Satoshi Action education team to produce articles for peer review and publishing in journals so that we can create a base of knowledge that when large investment companies, sovereign wealth funds, large institutions, and even lawmakers can look to when they're actually trying to understand the space, and that when we point to an article, a finding, a case study, we can point to it with credibility in terms of what we're saying being accurate, truthful,
peer-reviewed.
Exactly. So that's why that process exists. You put these articles through a rigorous process of analysis by a third party, and generally several third parties, and it gets published in a journal that has a specific readership and has a reputation to protect in and of itself to make sure that what it's reproducing is truthful. And so we have the opportunity through Satoshi Action, and now in my new role as one of the founding fellows at the Digital Assets Research Institute, which is a new institute focused on developing, again, peer-reviewed, high-quality research aimed at policy and sovereign wealth investment committees to kind of do a really good job of not specifically positioning Bitcoin, but repositioning how we look at all assets for assessment against environmental or social, particularly, metrics for, positive or negative scores across those metrics. Because the reality is, if you think that Bitcoin is bad for the environment because 44% of the on-grid mining uses a grid mix that includes some hydrocarbon burning to create electricity, you need to look at copper and gold and lithium from the same perspective, which is that if you're investing in those commodities or futures or any investment vehicle that includes a large company, an index of assets or anything, there's nothing on this planet that doesn't burn hydrocarbons. So penalizing Bitcoin for it, using a small proportion of its energy consumption in hydrocarbons, is disproportionately
What's an unfair judgment, right? And I mean, that reminds me of
being held to a different standard.
Yeah, and I mean that reminds me as well with I had Rupert on from the Calder KiwiSaver Fund, who have a Bitcoin carbon neutral cryptocurrency fund, they call it, but it is a Bitcoin fund, and I have had a critique of that because it's the only fund that explicitly requires itself to have a carbon offset, and they have a system in there, and they've got reporting around it, and there's no other fund in their portfolio or any other KiwiSaver that I'm aware of that actually does that. So they pick Bitcoin to be the one. And as you know, I mean, there's already quite a lot of sustainable Bitcoin being mined in New Zealand and elsewhere as well. So it's sort of a bit of an unfair judgment.
It's a drum I've been banging for a long time, which is that thermal electric Bitcoin mining is either going to be priced out very soon because of the low marginal cost of energy for renewables, or is already a very poor proposition for the people who are using it because of that exact reason. If you have to shovel in another lump of coal to get your next unit of energy out, you are at a disadvantage versus somebody who just has to wait for the wind to blow past a turbine to generate electricity, because you don't pay for the wind and you don't pay for the sun, you don't pay for the water that comes down the hill past your turbines. And so this is why we see rapid and rampant growth in the proportion of renewables powering Bitcoin mining. That's because Bitcoin miners seek out the energy with the lowest marginal cost, and we seek the niches and deep integration with generators who need somebody to pick up the slack of excess energy which is being generated when renewables are overbuilt, which they're required to be to meet peak demand and even to meet baseline demand for cities, for other sort of local offtake, whether it's mining, whether it's industry.
Well, I mean, that reminds me though, I mean, we're talking about sort of your overseas expansion here, but I mean, bringing it back to New Zealand and the question of electrification, decarbonisation, energy sovereignty, and there is some great work happening around the transition of farms and farm equipment and residential housing to be more electric, less hydrocarbons, less firewood, these kinds of things, moving to an electric heating system, etc. And the role of all of that, though, is dependent on having, good and abundant and affordable electricity, basically. And if you're relying on shipments of coal from Indonesia or, some other supply chain, that can be problematic. And obviously renewables can help a lot, but then you've got different pricing throughout the day with solar in particular. But there is sort of clearly a role there for load balancing and other technology which can help smooth out that price curve. So it seems that even though maybe there isn't the opportunity right now at scale, as per your hypothesis, maybe longer term, absolutely New Zealand needs Bitcoin mining in the mix to help bring that electrical future forward.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, there was a new paper published this week, at least it's in preprint, from Dennis Porter and Murray Rudd from Satoshi Action, which does a really great job of modeling the impact of Bitcoin mining on, VRE, variable renewable energy, its ability to monetize the VBIT, the variable piece, while maintaining the ability of, entirely renewably based grids to deliver low cost and ever decreasing cost energy to the eventual end users of why we build grids, which are cities, people in their homes, people in their businesses. But at the moment, the problem with all of this is that you get two outcomes from the process of electrification, at least from what I've observed, right? One is you get a market like New Zealand, which has failed to offer the investors in new renewables developments sufficient return on investment, despite high power prices, to invest in new renewable capacity. They're pretty marginal in New Zealand, and that's why it takes a long time, a lot of planning, and that's why we're not creating enough new renewable energy to meet the market. The other is what you get in certain places around the world, Northern Africa, Latin America, certain places in Southeast Asia as well. You get a misaligned incentive out of the government to overbuild renewable energy, and then you get a TSO, a transmission system operator, who won't invest in the transmission to get that new renewable energy to where it's consumed. Whether it's from the large dam in the north of the Amazon, which is overbuilt for the 90 million people that it powers, or whether it's the Paraguay side of the Paraguay-Brazil hydroelectric dam, where there's a lot of concentrated Bitcoin mining because of the Paraguay side not picking up its end of the consumption. And so you get an opportunity in both of those cases for Bitcoin to, one, in the first instance, bolster the case to build renewables because you've always got a buyer for energy. So you can justify higher financing costs, higher construction costs, because you've got a buyer of last resort for your energy. And in the second case, you've got a buyer of last resort for your energy when nobody else will buy it because there's nobody else in the area. You can put Bitcoin mining there to soak it up and to help generators who might find it really difficult to make their financing costs, give them a lifeline of streamed sats to pay their bills.
Yeah. Well, that's really awesome to hear. I mean, I think that there's some real opportunities there, and I think the reality of it is also quite interesting, trying to operate in some of these places, trying to get stuff done, maybe communication challenges. I mean, I think part of the delivery of these projects is predicated on the ability to get stuff done in country, which I imagine is going to be an exciting challenge to work with, even just getting materials and people in and these kinds of things. But if you can find ways of doing that, streamline those processes, it's sort of, I remember reading about this concept of like the pioneer species as well, where, Bitcoin mining can kind of come in and it sort of is one of the first things. Maybe the generation is there, or maybe it's not there, but it's sort of one of the first things that gets built, and then you maybe have communities starting to build around it. You've got digital nomads starting to move in, kind of this idea that you can, drop Bitcoin mining anywhere where there is electrical energy that's able to be produced, and then things can kind of grow from that. And I don't know if you heard of that sort of pioneer species concept.
You mean like the first fish to jump out of the water and grow legs?
Yeah. Well, even just, the first thing to grow in a desert that then sort of spawns an ecosystem.
Sure.
So I think that sort of can apply here. And it is interesting because, in the New Zealand case, it's already been established for some time. The market has its sort of incumbents, and, there is a conservatism. But in these new markets, it's maybe more dynamic. People are, willing to try things out, and it sounds really exciting.
Yeah, I really look forward to being able to talk about it in more detail
next time.
In the future. Yeah, and we'll make sure we record a podcast when we do the announcement of what's happening.
Just changing topic a little bit, Simon. So there's two other things. So I know you also, I don't know if you want to talk about this, but we've got your piece on adoption and sort of how you talk about Bitcoin adoption. Is that something you really talk about today? Or?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. What is that?
So that's another paper that I worked on with Murray Rudd from Satoshi Action, and it will be one of the first pieces of literature to be submitted under my new affiliation with the Digital Assets Research Institute, which is a great thing to get under that organization's belt. Is what I call a taxonomy of adoption. So Bitcoin is a lot like the internet, right? It's not a binary thing that you adopt. It's not like if you were a shopkeeper and you've got a whole lot of stock and you need a system to manage it. So you go to Lightspeed or Shopify and you get a point of sale system, and you log all your products in it, and that's great. It manages your inventory and all that sort of stuff. It doesn't change how the shopkeeper stores their wealth. It doesn't change how the storekeeper thinks about money. It doesn't change how the shopkeeper communicates. In the instance of the internet, it changed how we do almost everything. I mean, we're recording a podcast that didn't exist before the internet. Have we adopted the internet? There's these sort of layers to this adoption of the internet. When I came to pick you up this afternoon, Cody, we drove out to the studio using Google Maps. That's the internet. It touches every facet of how we live and operate. And it's about 40 years old. Bitcoin is about 15 years old, and it has this dimensionality to adoption that the internet does too. It's both a network and a currency. It's a platform for innovation. We're building stuff on Bitcoin. Lightning comes out of Bitcoin. Nostr comes out of Bitcoin. We use it as a unit of account. We use it as a medium of exchange. We use it for mining, as we've been discussing. It has multiple implications for energy that it also has for people, how they save their money. So what was happening in literature around, when I say literature, I mean the academic literature around examining the adoption of Bitcoin, what tended to be done and was done over and over and over, literally more than 100 times across different journals, was people ran an analysis called the technology acceptance model, which is what you would do if you were examining the impact or the effectiveness of the adoption of something like a point of sale system or a new piece of other technology, a type of heating, a type of security system, or, like a cybersecurity system for companies, or,
kind of a binary approach.
Laptop docks in offices and stuff. Like, how do people use these things? What makes them adopt these things? What makes that adoption stay? And they ran this multi-factor correlation kind of exercise where they go, okay, we define perceived risk as this. We define, personal innovativeness as this. And then they go, did this company, person, etc. adopt object A? Yes, no. What were the things that were most likely to predict its adoption? Perceived innovativeness, or, perceived risk, or all of these kinds of different variables. Not a single one of them, not only did I read them, I also passed them through ChatGPT and Claude to make sure that, there's an objective reading of these as well. And not a single one of them defines what Bitcoin adoption is, despite the fact that they go on to test the things that are its antecedent. And so when I was kind of looking at the literature on this, I said to Murray, my writing partner on this, we're missing the definition. And so what happens is all of these papers, they get a different result. Some of them say it's perceived innovativeness. Some people say it's perceived risk as the highest correlate to adoption. It makes no sense to kind of, what's that definition of insanity? It's doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. They do try the same thing over and over, and they do get a different result, which means that there's no consensus on what drives Bitcoin adoption. The reason is nobody's defined Bitcoin adoption. When you start to look at that as a concept, you realize, oh, okay, it's not a binary have or have not adopted decision here. It's not a, if you choose to save in Bitcoin, you take Bitcoin off the market, you stick it somewhere, have you adopted it? Have you just used it once? Meanwhile, if you start a Bitcoin podcast or you start a Bitcoin business, but you don't go to a Bitcoin meetup and you don't spend your sats on tokens to buy beers at the bar, have you adopted Bitcoin? If you're a large oil producing company and you decide it might be a good idea to harvest some carbon credits by mining Bitcoin with your otherwise vented methane, but you don't keep Bitcoin on your balance sheet, or you don't use Bitcoin to transact your international remittances, have you adopted Bitcoin? There's all of these sort of interesting nuances to understanding what Bitcoin adoption is, can be, why it's happening, what makes it sticky in some cases, and what makes it not sticky. Great example about stickiness from my perspective. El Salvador adopts Bitcoin as legal tender, produces the Chivo wallet, or develops the Chivo wallet with $30 US worth of Bitcoin for every El Salvadorian who downloads it and signs up. But use of the Chivo wallet drops pretty precipitously afterwards. Meanwhile, Vietnam has the third highest rate of ownership of digital assets in the world. It's functionally illegal in that country.
Oh, yeah.
You're not allowed to mine Bitcoin. You're not actually allowed to own or hold digital currency in that country. But it is highly utilized and persistent in that country. So there are these really interesting nuances to this discussion that are kind of enabled and uncovered when you start to look at the breadth of the dimensionality of what Bitcoin adoption can be. So in this paper, we obviously, we sort of problematize this literature. We look at the literature on Bitcoin adoption, find it very lacking, and so take this approach of, well, what should adoption of Bitcoin look like? And we went back to kind of a very classic, academic technique, which is to kind of design a taxonomy. Taxonomy has its origin in biology, where you say, well, what are the different kind of features of a species? What makes it a horse? What makes a horse? And then you can kind of, when you document all the things that make a horse, you have an understanding of what constitutes that species. And it's the same for Bitcoin, right? So we took all of the different types of entity that might adopt it, from individuals, institutions, communities, organizations, companies, cities, states, countries, the whole planet, and artificial intelligences. And we divided Bitcoin into Big B Bitcoin and Little B Bitcoin. Big B Bitcoin is the network, the financial network, right? That runs the rails that, Bitcoin is transacted on. It's the blockchain, and it's, the software that allows it to be transmitted. And Little B Bitcoin, which is the currency, the token that sits on it, sats, that sit on the network to allow commerce to be undertaken on the network. And then looked at all the dimensions under each of those of what adoption of Bitcoin looks like. And so with Big B Bitcoin, it's using Bitcoin for remittances, for transfers internationally. It's using it to exchange value at a high level. It's using it as a platform for innovation. Like, you could work in Big B Bitcoin to build solutions that either work into Bitcoin, whether you build a wallet or an exchange, or whether you work on building something that uses its ability to, coalesce computation and transacting into one event. And the same in Little B Bitcoin. You've got using it as a unit of account, using it as a medium of exchange, saving in it, investing in it, making a decision to either invest in Bitcoin or to invest in other options for investment, all those kinds of different dimensions. And so then we looked at that from the perspective of, well, what would the adoption of a company of Big B Bitcoin using it to innovate look like? What would an individual look like who's using Little B Bitcoin to save? What would an AI look like that's using Little B Bitcoin to make microtransactions? And so what we're hoping to get out of this is a framework that people can then use to go out and test this in the real world. So let's go to El Salvador and ask 1,000 El Salvadorians, what do you use Bitcoin for? And we can put it into this framework. We say, well, do you use Bitcoin as a medium of exchange? Do you use it as this? What would those behaviors look like?
Yeah.
And then you can actually understand with depth what people in El Salvador are doing it. And then you can go to Vietnam and you can compare what are the features of that country, of the environment they're operating in, the people are living in, that makes Bitcoin sticky there and not very sticky in El Salvador.
What I really like about that, Simon, so there's two things. So firstly, when you look at the way it's currently talked about, it's often a very crude measurement, which is basically people who own a thing. And often that number is maybe taken from an exchange, or it's kind of a very vague conception, which doesn't reflect the value that you might actually have, as you say. If you've got companies actively innovating on that, it's not just individuals holding small amounts of, Bitcoin. It's actually a whole nother level of kind of adoption where businesses are, working with this technology. And then the other thing is, I wrote this short piece recently myself around Bitcoin in New Zealand and how I see it possibly being able to be compared to something like fiber optic rollout or 5G, which is a kind of foundational tech that enables other things to be built on top of it, and how many businesses and things are possible because of faster, more accessible internet, for example. And maybe Bitcoin sort of can be looked at through that lens as well. How much other stuff can be enabled by this foundational technology that doesn't get reflected in pure, ownership wallet numbers, for example.
That's exactly it. So if you had no definition of adoption, how could you go and measure it in the real world, right? A bar accepting Bitcoin and the owner buying it off the bar to put into cold storage for themselves, is that really adoption of Bitcoin by that bar? you might have customers who are trying really hard to live on a Bitcoin standard. Are they really contributing to a Bitcoin standard if that Bitcoin just gets swept straight into dollars? So all of these kinds of questions can be now asked and answered in more rich detail, because we have a framework for understanding what adoption might actually look like. In the same way, when we look at internet adoption now, when you swipe your EFTPOS card at the supermarket, because they don't take Bitcoin
Yet,
you're using the internet. Whether you are some old person who swears that they don't do email, but you're using your EFTPOS card, you're using the internet. When you watch Netflix, when you buy stuff off Amazon, so much of the internet is kind of under the hood now. It's a layer that sits across and behind everything that we do. I bet almost nothing in this room wasn't examined, purchased on, or orders placed for the physical retail store over the internet. Even if you go down to a shop and buy something, the back end somehow works on the internet. The same opportunity exists to understand Bitcoin. When Lightning rails run point of sale payments for, the whole planet, all 8 billion people, because that's faster, cheaper, less kind of corporate capture than a credit card network. There's some level or metric of adoption there. But it doesn't mean that every single person in the world also has to work in Bitcoin and has to spend their days building new wallets with new features to interface with Bitcoin. But we can all understand that adoption of Bitcoin may mean just like the world running on those rails. So there's sort of there's a passive and an active adoption of Bitcoin too.
So you have those two poles with your piece, or?
So it was a fascinating process to go through, and I do generally feel like it's quite a novel piece of kind of research, because I haven't seen anybody kind of couch the idea in the same terms yet. We kind of uncovered some really interesting what we call ancillary and second order adoption dimensions. And so ancillary are like what I kind of referred to earlier, like if you were a African village whose microgrid was enabled by gridless compute, because they monetize a little hydro dam in your community that then gives you enough power to run lighting, refrigeration, the kind of standard of living that we would expect in New Zealand, but would never be able to be available to you without something like Bitcoin monetizing the grid when peak demand is less than, or when demand is less than peak. But they don't use Bitcoin to save, exchange. That's kind of an ancillary adoption. They get some of the benefit of Bitcoin being in their orbit, in their area, in their community, but they're sort of a second step away from adoption. So if you're not using that Bitcoin that's mined in your community to price your goods, to exchange things, to settle debts, sort of an ancillary adoption. And the same, think of second order adoption. So if you build a business on Bitcoin mining, many of us have, you're kind of, as a second order to Bitcoin, because the mining sector is something that interfaces with Bitcoin. And yes, it's part of the functional ecosystem that operates it. But a lot of what you're doing is monetizing computational power that's focused on Bitcoin. And so you're going to quite likely settle your debts with your energy producers, etc., in dollars, because they haven't adopted Bitcoin yet. And the same with like layer 2s. Layer 2s, like Lightning and Liquid, are built on top of Bitcoin. They have Bitcoin-like functionality. They might denominate, in the, the base unit of Bitcoin in sats. But they're not on the base chain. They're not on Big B Bitcoin. They're a sort of second, and we call it a second layer. They're a second order of adoption of Bitcoin. And so, there are these sort of fascinating facets that open up when you look at it from this, and you can kind of see how the ecosystem of things that touch and will touch Bitcoin in the future, aren't necessarily pure adoption dimensions, but they are sort of related.
Okay. I'm just curious on that. So was there any research that was in this same paradigm that looked at the rollout of the internet or the web, and how far along are you with this process in terms of this paper? Like, is this ready for publication? So yeah, those are my two questions.
Yeah, so this is, one of the things we did when we were starting to think about this was to lean on that kind of conceptualization of the internet, of a very, broadly adopted, non-binary adoption of a technology, and that it isn't captured by the existing models of technology adoption. So there are some really great references out there about that. And so this is something that, I've had in the back of my mind for a long time, is that the internet was the interface of three innovations: TCP/IP, HTTP, and HTML, right? All three different protocols which come together to create what is the base or the backbone of the modern internet. Right, that's what the internet is, and there's everything that's built on top of it, whether it's a streaming platform, whether it's a social network, uses those three innovations in a way, and none of those innovations was enough to create an internet of themselves. Needed all three of them to come together functionally to deliver the internet. And Bitcoin's the same, right? It's distributed ledgers or blockchains, it's proof of work, and it's cryptographic signing of transactions. And so when all three of those fields or those areas of computer science came together in the white paper as kind of interfacing or touching to create Bitcoin, the sort of the value or the potential of that triumvirate is much larger than each of them individually.
Well, actually, you talk about the internet. Important to delineate the internet from the web, and those trifecta you mentioned. For me, that would speak to the web, as in that was the inflection point, because you had, the ARPANET and the internet historically. So it's a technical thing, but that sort of idled along, and conceptually, maybe Bitcoin base chain, as it was for the first many years, was kind of like the internet in that it was the latent cables beneath the sea and purely TCP/IP, but it was when those other two factors came in, HTML and HTTP, that meant the web could suddenly gain adoption. So sorry, not to critique that, but it feels like maybe that's what we're sort of saying here is, Bitcoin, if you think of it in a pure, like, do you have Bitcoin or not, that sort of binary isn't reflective of these higher order things such as Lightning, and other integrations where maybe people aren't even aware.
Yeah. Well, I was talking about this with somebody last night at BitKiwi. Like, if all that happens in Bitcoin is miners mine Bitcoin and people buy Bitcoin off them and put it into cold storage, that's just a hamster wheel. Like, there's no growth in the ecosystem. Nothing interesting really happens with Bitcoin.
Well, at least savings, maybe. Yeah.
Sure.
It takes gold.
Sure.
Yeah.
But like gold, for example, at least has some competing use cases for that asset above and beyond storage, whether it's jewelry, whether it's, like if all that happens is that people, that miners mine Bitcoin and people buy it off miners and put it into cold storage, there's very little use case for it. It's not going to grow as an ecosystem. It is not going to drive demand for it as novel and unique ways to lock it up. At least gold has jewelry, electronics, and different use cases to compete with and create demand for
the commodity itself.
Yeah. Don't get me wrong, it's an amazing store of value because, it doesn't react, it's non-reactive, it doesn't rust or corrode. When you put a gold bar in a safe, you can expect it to be in the same shape, 10 years or 100 years later. And the same with Bitcoin. But, there are interesting, novel, useful ways to create demand for Bitcoin, which might drive its price going up, which is what we all hope it will do, right? Number go up, tech, as we say. We can lock it up in Lightning and use it for microtransactions. When we take Bitcoin off the base chain, put it into a Lightning channel, it's not available on the base chain anymore until it's settled back when you close that channel. So growth in the Lightning network is a way to lock up more Bitcoin, to drive its use, to drive the need for more people to enter it and adopt it in terms of making microtransactions, paying for stuff day to day. But it's not a great way of storing sats. So that's why we have the base chain and cold storage. So when we have a good understanding of what and why people would use Bitcoin for different use cases, we can create the frameworks, the opportunities, the businesses, and the the technical requirements, whether it's wallets with particular features, whether it's investment vehicles, whether it's point of sale hardware, that can allow people to adopt it in the way that they want to.
Yeah. Or what I like about that sort of framework is that it is a lot more comprehensive, and it's not this sort of narrow lens on the silly question, which would be like, well, no one in my city accepts Bitcoin, therefore Bitcoin is not useful, which is kind of a critique, right?
100%.
But the reality of it as this kind of underlying technology, which maybe people, it's in their KiwiSaver, or it's in other parts of their, maybe they've got cheaper electricity because Bitcoin mining in their region is helping smooth out the renewables curve, and they didn't even know that that's a benefit that's accruing. I think there's a lot of things like that which are maybe hard to see when you don't see the physical money going across the table, right?
A lot of people will have seen gains in their indexed shares portfolio over the last 3 years that are driven by the fact that MicroStrategy's stock price has exploded. And they have indirect exposure to MicroStrategy shares through their index, whether it's an index of the New York Stock Exchange or what have you. I'm not sure if MicroStrategy is in the S&P 500 or where you could gain indexed exposure to it specifically, but you may be benefiting from Bitcoin if you have a KiwiSaver that's invested in the US stocks. And so you're indirectly, it begs the question, are you indirectly adopting Bitcoin? Because Michael Saylor has created a speculative attack on the dollar through, his acquisition of Bitcoin using the various mechanisms that are available to him. So we're entering a really interesting space where, passive or indirect, or both passive and indirect adoption of Bitcoin becomes something like somebody who doesn't do emails using their EFTPOS card at the supermarket.
Yeah, well,
is adopting the internet.
I've often thought, someone may not use the internet, but it doesn't mean they're not on the internet. And so I think that's maybe one way of looking at it with Bitcoin. You may choose not to have a wallet or to self-custody your funds, etc. But you may be still subject to what Bitcoin is doing, and it's very hard to get away from that. And this is all connected. Looping it back to what we were talking about with the mining and some of these critiques of how the sort of the sustainable environmental side of things. The sort of the one thing that's picked out is Bitcoin mining, and it's sort of looked at with this lens of its energy use and these kinds of quite simplistic takes. But it's such an important part of the world's future economy, the way infrastructure is built. It's sort of, it's not, it doesn't really make sense to me. And the fact that you guys are doing this research and kind of providing an academic framework to kind of counter unfortunately some of these FUD arguments that no one's using it, for example, with the adoption piece, or that Bitcoin mining and Bitcoin use in general is bad, quote unquote. Just having some academic rigor, I think that's valuable in the space.
Yeah, it's and it's resonant with a lot of the journals that we're approaching for submission of these documents or of these papers, because they're used to getting opinion-based content on Bitcoin. The Alex DeVries kind of
Digicom
standard. Yeah, well, exactly. That's the tier of content that gets submitted to them to date, and they all have to be marked as opinion, not peer-reviewed research, and it doesn't really give real research as much of a base to build off. The old phrase, standing on the shoulders of giants, is what we do in academia. We look at what everybody else has done, and then we try very hard to extend that in a credible way. And the truth of it is, there is basically no research of
hard.
Any credibility.
It's hard. The people don't touch
Bitcoin.
it. Yeah.
And the other thing, unfortunately, is, of course, it gets lumped in with crypto.
Yes.
So, I suggested earlier that there are 100 or more papers that do exactly the same experiment on adoption. They all mention Bitcoin, but they all include crypto as well. And so, through Satoshi Action and through Dari, it'll be Bitcoin only, which will at least give some separation as well in the academic sphere of those two different concepts, which I think is obviously crucial as well.
Yeah. That's awesome. So this paper, what is the title of it? Can people find it, or when will they be able to find it?
Well,
online?
it is creatively named A Taxonomy of Bitcoin Adoption.
Okay.
And we're just going through the submission process at the moment to a couple of journals who were sort of shortlisted as the best candidates, like kind of finance and economics journals.
Yes.
There's a super fun process to go through where you write your own paper and you reference it, carefully, and then you start identifying which journals you might submit it to, and then you have to reformat the entire thing, 12,000, 14,000 words in this case, to their referencing and formatting requirements.
I see.
And every journal that you submit to will have its own formatting requirements, and so for every submission, you get to reformat and re-reference your entire paper.
Oh, wow.
So it's a bit of a process, but the hard yards are done in terms of writing, refining, getting feedback on, and sort of finalizing the content and the crux of the paper.
Yeah, that's really awesome. Well, I look forward to seeing that. I have had a little glimpse that you sent through of an earlier draft of that, but I would look forward to seeing the final piece when it does get into the journals and gets out there and provides just a really good, rigorous take on this, and I think a new way of looking at Bitcoin adoption.
Yeah, my real hope is that somebody wants to pick it up and then go and test it, from an empirical perspective, like build some surveys, interviews, and do some real world research to sort of test its validity as an approach. And I really hope that we can then come back with those results and refine it to something that really fits a model of what the real world kind of looks like.
That's really awesome.
That's the aim that I have for it. Yeah.
Well, look, man, I think there's so much more, but I know we do need to wrap up. But I think just the final piece then, Simon, you've shared your work with Stacker and then the adoption paper that you've been working on. But the other piece is Lightning Pay, which is a really exciting business in New Zealand, which is making a bit of a splash. So I thought we could just do a little bit on that.
Awesome. Yeah, Lightning Pay is just, I just feel incredibly lucky to have joined that team. Brandon and Rob, who really founded Lightning Pay, and I kind of signed on later as a maybe a bit of a tag along, but I hope I'm adding some value there. Is just incredible. So our aim with Lightning Pay is to connect New Zealand to the Lightning Network, and it works in various ways. We're all sick of going to the butcher or the dairy or any really like small to medium sized business that has to tack on a surcharge for payments for using PayWave or any other kind of contactless payments of anywhere from 1.5 to 2.5 to 3%. And if you're one of these retailers, you have to make a decision. Do you want to eat that cost and then have 2.5% less margin, or do you want to pass it on and have people make a is it worth it decision about your products when they're purchasing? So it started with the opportunity we can create a modern contactless payments solution that runs on Lightning, because Lightning's so fast, incredible, and settles instantly, that people could then use at first alongside, but then replacing those really expensive point of sale costs. Because the reality is those costs aren't one company clipping that ticket. It's any number of entities that sit behind your point of sale system and your bank and what we call the scheme, which is the credit card that you're on, whether it's American Express or Visa or MasterCard or any others. There's interchanges which allow for the flows between different tiers of the banking system, and there are switches which do kind of a very similar thing. There are clearinghouses, and there are like national and then there are international clearinghouses, and every single point wants to get paid, and every single point wants to mitigate their risk. And actually, it's in the white paper, the Bitcoin white paper, that one of the reasons that the current financial system doesn't work very well is that each party in this intermediated system is trying to mitigate their risk of chargebacks, of somebody saying, actually, you weren't supposed to get that $100. My customer has asked for it back. You need to give it back. And if they have to say, well, I've already given it to the switch, I can't get it back, they're on the hook for it. So they wait for as long as possible so that they know they're not going to have to give that $100 back, in the case that it was spent fraudulently or it was a mistake or any other number of the ways that they could end up with somebody else's money by mistake. And that's why it takes, 11 days for the dairy that you bought, some Hubba Bubba from to, I buy Hubba Bubba every day. No, that's why it takes that dairy, 11 days to get settlement, is because everybody wants to sit behind, mitigate their own risk and charge for the privilege. So what we can do with Lightning Pay is we can go peer-to-peer. And so in building that point of sale system, which now is live, and you can sign up to Lightning Pay if you're a merchant, and we will allow you to take Lightning Bitcoin at point of sale. We'll exchange that to dollars for you for free, and we'll put it in your bank account the next day. No, and we only put it into your bank account the next day to make sure that we've gathered up all your transactions for the day, and we're giving you the total balance. We want to give people access to their own money back. In building the system that allows us to do that, we have built what I feel pretty kind of unabashed in saying is the best Bitcoin exchange I've ever used.
So I could say it for you as well, because I think it is actually the best Bitcoin exchange experience I've ever used as well for buying Bitcoin.
And yeah, we're constantly improving it as well. And so with this week, we just augmented the two-factor security with passkeys, which means that rather than having to put in a 2FA code, you can now use your Face ID on your phone to make sure that it's really you that's using your device. And now you can use Lightning Pay to smash buy Bitcoin and have it delivered to your Lightning wallet in one click. The way that works is that we use open banking systems, open banking APIs, which gives us, which means that when you click that button, you're giving us permission to withdraw that total from your bank account in dollars. We exchange it into Bitcoin and we send it to your Lightning wallet from our Lightning node, which means we never actually touch your money. We just sort of sniff it as it goes by to make sure it's all the right amounts going to the right places. But so we have a instant one button click.
It's beautiful. I use
exchange.
Yeah. And you can also set up DCAs, so you can automatically buy Bitcoin every day, and it will get sent to your Lightning address.
That's right.
If you want.
Every day, every week, every month.
You can do hourly as well, I believe.
There are some real honey badgers out there, man, and we are responsive to what people want. I mean, this has been one of the amazing bits of the journey for us. Has been the users. Not our users, our friends, our best friends in the world. Their passion for it has been incredible. We get incredible user feedback, and we get just really exceptional and useful feedback about what people would like to see. And
I was pretty blown away. I mean, as we were talking about last night, I just had a casual phone call with Rob, and I said, it'd be great to be able to pay my bills through the system. If you can put, if I can sell Bitcoin and get fiat, can I sell Bitcoin and get the fiat put into someone else's bank account, basically pay bills? And you may have had feedback from others, but within a few weeks that feature became live, and I'm now able to pay my fiat bills through Lightning Pay without actually having to touch the fiat myself.
Yeah, that's right. And actually, it's cheaper to buy Bitcoin through Lightning Pay and pay your bills than it is to pay your bill with a credit card and use it. To pay that bill online using a card. Doesn't matter which card it is, because
3%.
2.5% to 3%. Yeah. We're 1% plus maybe 0.2%, which is the exchange fee that we have to pay and pass on. So it's cheaper to buy Bitcoin and pay your bills with Lightning Pay.
Yeah, and I mean, what I love about it as well is that the incentives align for you to also have the merchant side and the exchange side, because they provide liquidity for each other, and there's a real good incentive structure there, which means I think I agree it is the best Bitcoin buy experience in New Zealand. Certainly much better than the incumbents, and I think there's a real bright future ahead. And obviously Bitcoin only, really easy to work with.
Bitcoin only, always fast. And forever. Yeah, that's right.
Lightning fast. Yeah, so that's really awesome. So and if people want to sign up for that, they want to join, where can they go?
Yeah, so lightningpay.nz, super easy to sign up. We do all of our KYC in-house, so where all of the other exchanges you may sign up for will outsource your KYC to one of those head scanning iPhone app type, data harvesting monsters. We do it all in-house, and that's because, when you sign up and you sign up your bank account to us, we get most of the KYC information that we need from the bank. And so really our KYC process is double checking that the person who signed up to Lightning Pay was the same person that signed up to the bank. And so we do all of that in-house. We keep that to a single person where possible, and we retain only the information that we absolutely need to. And it is stored on a secure server behind, our own 2FA required logins. So we genuinely believe we also have the best user security out of any exchange. And we know that because we know that Bitcoiners find the need to conduct KYC as a pretty invasive process. We have to as a financial service provider in New Zealand. And so we've managed to find the lightest touch way to do that work.
I love it, man. This is so awesome. I'm so excited. So much stuff is happening, and just even the conversations yesterday at BitKiwi. I'm bullish on New Zealand, what you're working on, what our friends are working on in Bitcoin in New Zealand. But we might wrap it up there, Simon.
Awesome.
Talked about a lot of stuff. Talked about Stacker. Talked about your taxonomy of adoption of Bitcoin and Lightning Pay. So, is there anywhere you want to send people? Any final thoughts you want to share?
Look, I just want to thank everybody for using Lightning Pay, and I'm on Twitter. Cody can put my handle in the show notes. But just a massive thanks to the guys from BitKiwi for organising an awesome meetup yesterday, one of many. To all the Bitcoiners in New Zealand who used Lightning Pay. We couldn't have done it without you, but we just are so appreciative of the recognition of our work in that space, and to just watch out for Stacker because it's about to tip the scale.
It's coming out.
It's coming. Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, Simon.
Thanks, Cody.
Thank you for listening. I do hope you enjoyed the show. I am Cody Allingham, and that was the Transformation of Value. If you would like to get in touch, please send me an email at hello@thetransformationofvalue.com, and I will get back to you.